Wanted to welcome you all to John Jay again for the Shaugnessy Speaker Series. Very happy that you all made it here. I know it's hard to give up a Friday afternoon in May. We have two unbelievable guests today, Jim Brown from Wisconsin and Matt Gold from City Tech. And we do not have a sponsor to thank. This one is unsponsored. So any of you have a sponsorship connection, please see me for the next event so we can keep this going here. I wanted to thank our hostess with the mostest, Mark Macbeth, who not only did all the food prep, but did it under budget, which was very helpful, very helpful. And I want to just invite Amanda LaCastro to come up to tell us all about that camp, which goes on tomorrow. Enjoy the show.
Thanks, Tim. So I'm sure many of you in the audience know that this is our kickoff event for That Camp Digital Writing. And I'm going to do something that maybe some of you have seen on Jimmy Fallon, but please use the hashtag TCDW14, That Camp Digital Writing 14. And as you know, this is part of the Mina Shaugnessy Speaker Series, so I want to give a special thank you to John Jay for hosting us, to the WPA Metro affiliate, and to the CUNY-wide Composition and Rhetoric Group for hosting us tonight. I can't really think of a better way to kick off That Camp Digital Writing than with a conversation between Matt Gold and Jim Brown, but I do want to give you a little background on what that camp is, just for those of you who don't know. That camp is what we call an unconference. And it's trying to remix the traditional academic conference to be, first of all, free for participants to come. It's donation-based, and that's done all through sponsorship, so I'll get to all of our sponsors in a minute. But it's also trying to remix the model by keeping it local and bringing people that are in a region together to create a community of like-minded people to discuss topics that they really feel the need to talk through, make, play, and build around. So that Camp Digital Writing started between Elizabeth Cornell from Fordham University and I, because we had a conversation about how do we get training to do digital writing in higher education. And we wanted to start that conversation, and here we are. So our sponsors for that Camp Digital Writing, besides this first kickoff event with John Jay, are the Graduate Center Digital Initiatives, the Graduate Center Interactive Technology and Pedagogy Group, the Fordham University and the Fordham University Digital Humanities Student Run Group. And also we have City Tech Open Lab, who made these wonderful bookmarks, which are in the back, that you can take. So thank you very much for coming. And again, use the hashtag TCDW14 to keep in touch with everything going on the next couple of days. We'll see many of you at Fordham tomorrow. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Dominique Zeno. It's really great to see so many of you here. Tim McCormick asked me to introduce Jim, so I will do that. And then Jill Belli will introduce Matt Gold. So I had the great pleasure of looking closely at Jim's blog over the past few days. And there was much to discover, so I just want to tell you a little bit about him, though many of you in the audience probably know much of what I will say. In a post on his blog from September 2013 titled "Speaking Across the Divide," Jim offered the following advice. He said, "Collaborate and talk to individuals in your department and elsewhere, and ignore confusing actions of dinosaur organizations that are 30 years behind the times. You'll find that those individual interactions are more fruitful than any attempt to get that dinosaur to budge." That is, I think, why we're all here this afternoon, to enact that very idea, to hear two scholars deeply committed to strategies for innovative and collaborative thinking and writing model the kinds of interactions that we can turn around and foster in our own departments and academic communities. The ways in which Jim has digested the reciprocity between making, writing, and learning is evident across his course syllabi and his assignment structures, carefully scaffolded, yet leaving plenty of room for exploration and even for productive failure. He would probably cringe at the thought of standing up here reading his teaching philosophy, but I think it's worth sharing, so I'll do that for him. Sorry, Jim. So in his teaching philosophy, Jim describes what he calls the ethic of tinkering, which he applies to both technology and to rhetorical analysis. In an early undergraduate rhetoric course Jim taught while completing his doctoral work in English with a concentration in digital languages and literacies at the University of Texas at Austin, the course was called Anthologics. He and his students compiled an anthology based on a research question, analyzing the rhetorical approaches of various positions taken on the topic and writing a preface that mapped those rhetorical moves. In another course, students learned to write code, program Arduino circuit boards, and create video games. While I was looking at the course blog for a 100-level course Jim's teaching this semester on literature and video games, Jim's fusion of rhetorical and technological skill sets felt seamless to me. By this month, his students will have completed 5 assignments in that course. They live tweeted his lectures with an emphasis on summarizing, linking, and questioning. They used the web service Storify to identify a specific pattern or conversation in those lecture tweets. They reviewed a, quote, classic video game, so that means pre-1983, and then they created their own game in small groups, anticipating a user's experience playing it. And finally, they partnered up to actually play the game, live tweeting the playing experience and composing a narrative of the discoveries and struggles they encountered. The parallel Jim sees between technological and theoretical tinkering is the clear through line in his research and scholarship as well. A 2008 article, SJ's Ethos, Rethinking Textual Origins and Intellectual Property, published in 3Cs, won the University of Texas Department of Writing and Rhetoric James L. Canavy Award for Scholarship in Rhetoric and Composition. He's also published in Present Tense, Pedagogy, and Computers and Composition, among many other journals. Jim recently received a $20,000 grant from the University of Wisconsin-Madison Graduate School for his book and multimedia book project, Making Machines, in which he approaches theories as machines that help us make things. Finally, his book, Ethical Programs, Hospitality and the Rhetorics of Software, about the persuasive dimensions of digital media, is forthcoming in the Digital Humanities series of the University of Michigan Press in 2015. Finally, starting this fall, Jim will begin a new position at Rutgers-Camden as Assistant Professor of English and Director of a new Digital Studies Center, the Digital Studio at Rutgers-Camden. The metro area Comp-rhet and Digital Humanities communities will be very lucky to have him nearby. So please join me in welcoming Jim Brown to John Jay, to the Mina Shaugnessy Lecture Series, and to the metro area.
So now I'm going to read you all of Matt's teaching philosophy. No, I'm kidding. That's actually a hard act to follow. So I just want to start off by welcoming both Jim and Matt to this event. Matt, who many of you know, is an associate professor of English and Digital Humanities at New York City College of Technology, here at CUNY, and also at the Graduate Center. He is the editor of Debates in the Digital Humanities, which came out in 2012 from University of Minnesota, and which was also in an exciting move for such a press put out in an open access form online, which was, sets a really nice precedent. And he's also working on a new book, DH, A Short Introduction to the Digital Humanities, which is forthcoming from Johns Hopkins University Press. His DH projects have been supported by grants from things as wide-ranging as the NEH Office of Digital Humanities, the National Science Foundation, Sloan Foundation, the Department of Education, Ford Foundation. I could go on and on and on. But I actually wanted to just say a few words about Matt as I've known him. I've been fortunate enough to know Matt over the past number of years in a number of capacities. I was his student at the Graduate Center. He was on my dissertation committee, and now, in sort of a twist of fate, is also my colleague and my office mate at City Tech. So I feel privileged to have gotten to know Matt in a lot of capacities. And I've really learned a lot from him sort of about what it means to be not only a scholar and a digital humanist, but also, a professional and a collaborator in the field. And one of the things I really just want to say about Matt is, when I was a doctoral student, Matt was really, really supportive of a lot of projects that are happening at the Graduate Center at the student level. He's sort of joined in as a mentor on the Writing Studies Tree project that I do with Ben and Amanda, and sort of full-fledged gave us his support in that, and he continues to do that and collaborate with both students and faculty across CUNY, which is really exciting. And I think that, having entered the CUNY system in 2005, where at the time really work in digital scholarship, digital writing, digital rhetoric, digital humanities wasn't really occurring at all. It was happening, sort of piecemeal, but there was no voice to make that happen at an institutional level. The transformation that occurred in less than a decade, which I think is largely due to Matt's efforts there, or he's shaking his head no, he won't admit this, but he's at least, seen this amazing work happening and giving it, a channel to happen, to the point where we now have full-out digital initiatives, we have digital fellows programs, we have grants that support this, and Matt also at City Tech was very intimately involved with Open Lab. You all know the CUNY Academic Commons, which is now part of the Commons in the Box, which a lot of institutions such as MLA are taking forth. So his impact, I think, for a lot of us is really to embrace collaboration, embrace these digital methods, and to think about doing scholarship in a different way. So I want to personally thank him for that, and to say that, I think I've been fortunate to have Matt as a teacher first, a mentor, a colleague, and a friend, and I think he's been that to a lot of us at CUNY and beyond, and we're grateful to have him here, and also Jim to talk with us. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much to Jill and Dominique for those extremely kind introductions. It's hard to talk after that. But I do want to thank also the organizers of the Shaugnessy Lecture Series, and especially those who I've been in communication with over the last couple of days and weeks and months to get this event together. Tim McCormick, Amanda LaCastro, Mark Macbeth, Amy Wan, and also Amanda Elizabeth for organizing That Camp Digital Writing. It's just an exciting couple of days here at CUNY and at Fordham for the work that we do. And thanks also to the whole organizing committee for their work in pulling this together. I'm also incredibly excited to be here because I respect Jim and Jim's work so much. You've heard about his accomplishments, and I won't rehearse them now, but I will say that I've seen him present at the Modern Language Association on Obama and procedural rhetoric. He attended a C's presentation that I did in, I think, 2011 on this topic that we're discussing today, composition and rhetoric and digital humanities. And I see Jim as an example, and I actually cited him in my talk that I did then as someone who is really productively working at the nexus of these two fields. So I wanted to begin by telling you a little bit about what we have planned. Jim and I are going to give short talks. I'm not going to say the time limit, but they should be very short. We're not going to be overwhelming you with papers here at the beginning, but we do want to kind of set the stage and frame the debates that we'd like to talk about. Once we've each spoken, we are going to move into a kind of question and answer between the two of us, a dialogue between the two of us for a little while before opening it up to everyone else and to the audience to speak. I also want to point out that if you can get onto Twitter, the hashtag for this event is TCDW14, so we're using the That Camp digital writing hashtag. Also, if you are able to get onto the web, there's a bit.ly link up here. It's bit.ly/crossing state lines, and that link will take you to a Google Doc that could potentially be used for notes. Our idea is that what we're trying to do today is to find productive points of connection between Comp-rhet and digital humanities. And so we want to invite all of you here today, but also others who may be listening in via Twitter to contribute to that document. And our hope is that by the end of today and ongoing from today, that together we could build out a list of sample projects that we could continue to become a space for collaboration. Since I'm going to present, in at least the way we've kind of framed this, the sort of DH or digital literary studies perspective, I thought I'd start with a quotation from Stanford scholar Franco Moretti, who you might know from his book Graphs, Maps, Trees, or his more recent book Distant Reading. Moretti is someone who's known for his work in text mining and someone who's really trying to get scholars of literature to think differently about the way they approach literary texts, in part by thinking of computational approaches that examine whole corpora of text instead of reading closely. So he frames his method as distant reading instead of close reading. And in a recent article, he writes the following. He said, "This brings me to the question I have often asked, and rightly so. Will the humanities of the digital age lose what has so powerfully characterized them, the experience of reading a book from beginning to end? And I don't want to answer for the humanities in general, but for those of us in digital literary studies, the answer has to be yes. Reading a book from beginning to end loses its centrality because it no longer constitutes the foundation of knowledge. Our objects are much bigger than the book, or much smaller than a book, and in fact usually both things at once, but they're almost never a book. The pact with the digital has a price, which is this drastic loss of measure. Books are so human-sized, now that right size is gone. We're not happy about the loss, but it seems to be a necessary consequence of the new approach." Now, I think we could argue with several points there. We could argue with the question of the book as having ever been the right size, the fact that for as long as people have been doing literary study, they may be looking at the unit of the poem or the unit of the manuscript leaf. But I think there's something interesting that Moretti's pointing to about issues of scale and how the intrusion of these digital methods into traditional literary critical work has shaken things up a little bit and shaken our assumptions. And I think no matter how you feel about the digital humanities, whether you think that digital humanities are kind of overblown or overhyped, or whether you think they are an experimental set of methods and tools for interrogating text and images, I think this question of scale is one that is very real, and it's productive for us to think about. So I wanted to start there because it seems to me that if we might take Moretti's point that we are at a moment of dislocation, perhaps at the unit of study of what we study of the book, we might find some productive space within that dislocation to think about methods of connection and means of connection that need to be articulated. And I think together, Jim and I, the way we structured this presentation, we hope to do that. My job here is to discuss and try to historicize a little bit DH as a construct. So I'm going to do that briefly and then turn it over to Jim. So digital humanities, or DH, is a term that has been used since the early 2000s to describe an emerging field of humanities scholarship, teaching, and service that is grounded in digital sources, methodologies, tools, and platforms. And while I'm speaking here, while I'm reading this, what I have is a little slideshow that will go through and sort of cycle through some sample projects in the digital humanities across a range of kind of areas of DH. I was going to go through them each individually and sort of explicate each one, but I thought that that might take too much time, so I'll just let them cycle through while I speak. So DH work can involve methods such as data mining, text mining, geospatial analysis, information visualization, text encoding, digital scholarly editing, digital archives and preservation, digital forensics, and computational linguistics, among others. An increasingly prominent strain of digital humanities scholarship, and I need to say it's the one that I identify with most, focuses on scholarly communication in networked environments, examining the ways in which scholars are using networked platforms to share their work publicly in various states of draft as a way of augmenting or circumventing the traditional social economies of journal and book-based scholarly production and reception. Such work has begun to transform, or at least to raise significant questions about the traditional academic processes of peer review, tenure and promotion, and the dissemination of scholarship itself. Any attempt to define the digital humanities represents a foray into contested terrain, since there is wide disagreement and confusion about the contours of the field, if indeed one even accepts that it is a field, rather than a loose constellation of associated methodologies. In the humanities done digitally, Kathleen Fitzpatrick locates this confusion at the basic linguistic level. Should digital humanities take a singular or a plural verb? Digital humanities is or digital humanities are? A neat externalization of the larger questions surrounding the identity of the field. As Matt Kirschenbaum has noted, essays that seek to define DH have become so ubiquitous that they're almost genre pieces for DH scholars, and Kirschenbaum has authored 2 canonical pieces on the subject. Most DH scholars might agree with John Unsworth's broad contention and definition that DH is simply using computational tools to do the work of the humanities, but key disagreements continue to surround DH. Among them, is DH a discrete field of academic inquiry or a meta field that bridges multiple disciplines? Where does new media studies leave off and digital humanities begin? Is DH, in the words of Mark Marino, merely a temporary epithet that will seem redundant when all work in the humanities becomes digital? And does DH challenge traditional academic practices or merely transpose them into new forms? And I think we've especially seen recently also a great deal of pushback against the digital humanities that I think Jim is going to talk about a little bit. And I'm sure we'll get to during the question and answer. But what's clear at this moment of emergence and transition is that the digital humanities has become a locus for larger debates about the future of the academy and the fate of scholarship in a digital age. The origins of DH, however, are considerably more constrained, and I think that those origins and this movement from a very constrained set of origins to this wide efflorescence of work is something that's at the root of some of the tensions that we're hoping to get at today. So I'm going to give you a kind of thumbnail history of DH just as a way of kind of grounding some of our discussions today. This history comes out of an essay that is published in an open access format in the Blackwell's Companion to Digital Humanities, which was, is often cited as the volume that sort of gave the name Digital Humanities to the field. This essay is by Susan Hockey. And what she did is she sort of divided up the history of humanities computing, which is the name by which DH was known before it became DH, into 4 periods: beginnings, consolidation, new developments, and era of the internet. In the 50s to 70s, we did have the beginning where most of the work, it really began with Thomas Busa, who was working on the Roberto Busa, working on a concordance of St. Thomas Aquinas' work, and he made a very famous visit to Thomas Watson of IBM, who helped him put together his work. I should say, though, even as I present that kind of origin story, that history that I've just told you of DH is one that's being, I would say, excavated and examined in various ways. Many people right now are looking at various ways of rehistoricizing, rethinking the early history of humanities computing and finding new trails that lead from different historical figures to moments that we have now. From the 70s to the 80s, we did have this moment of professionalization in the discipline, but it was still largely, I think, work being done in computational linguistics, stylometrics, authorship studies. In the 80s and 90s, we had a consolidation and a real movement of DH, I think, as literary text, TEI encoding. And these large, especially in the 90s, these large digitization projects that I think DH is still very often identified with today, and I think sometimes erroneously seen as being only about these kind of large archival textual projects like the Whitman Archive, the Perseus Digital Library, et cetera. In the 2000s, we had the coining of digital humanities as a term and the creation of the Office of Digital Humanities at the NEH. And now we have what I think of as this kind of this DH moment, this moment where DH has become a subject that has become very elastic and loose, and that is no longer, there are absolutely people doing work in computational linguistics within DH, but we now have many people identifying so many different kinds of work with DH that it has become hard to create a core definition of it. But as I said earlier, I think that that moment to me means that DH at this moment is contested terrain, which opens up new possibilities. And so now I'd like to ask Jim to come up and explore some of them.
Well, first I want to say, as Matt did, thank you to all of you for being here, and thank you especially to Jill, Dominique, Amanda, Tim, and Amy, and everyone who helped make this happen, especially Tim, who babysat me all day and showed me, took me to lunch and sort of showed me around. So thank you very much. I'm excited to be here, especially excited to have this conversation with Matt. We've had this conversation in various forms previously, as he mentioned, at SEAS, on Twitter, and we always have a productive version of this conversation, I think, and unfortunately that's all too rare. I think he might agree. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those histories that Matt was talking about and how they intersect with some of the histories of my home field, composition and rhetoric, and how those histories intersect, diverge, and what we might make of the sometimes unproductive conversations that do happen between folks who sort of identify as Comp-rhet and those who identify as digital humanities. So I should first point out that, make sure that this thing is working. There we go. So I'm talking about a slash here today. Of course, Comp-rhet is usually dealing with that slash over there. I'm going to skip right past that one today and talk about this one. This one is complicated enough. And if you're interested in that conversation, there's a great issue, two issues of Enculturation, the journal that I edit about that very topic. So I could have called this talk, What is Composition and Rhetoric and What is it Doing in English Departments, by cribbing Matt Kirschenbaum's title from this volume, right? Because it's basically, I mean, we could ask that exact same question of Comp-rhet that we ask of DH. This is the opening of Matt's chapter in Matt's volume, in Matt's edited collection. And I grabbed the screenshot. This is the open access version that was referenced earlier. I grabbed the screenshot because there's a lot of talk about Comp-rhet sort of being neglected by DH, that work in computers and writing has been happening for a long time, but that folks in DH don't always recognize that. I'm going to walk through how those complaints and arguments happen. But the first thing I really want to note here is this, that the very first, almost one of the first things that appears in Matt Gold's edited collection is a quote from Cindy Self, who is a composition and rhetoric scholar, computers and writing pioneer. So it's right here for us to find and see if we would only look. I think the people who lob these complaints perhaps look past this, read right past it. Maybe we all read right past epigraphs. I don't know. Maybe we just don't read them. So how does this happen? Why is it not seen? Or if it is seen, why is it not seen in a sort of positive light? We tend to focus more on things like this. This is Alan Liu's map of the digital humanities. It's a Prezi. It's available online. I'm sure someone is tweeting a link to it as I'm saying it. Comp-rhet, digital rhetoric, computers and writing appear nowhere on this map. So we're going to talk about why and how we might respond to that. I'll come back to that in a minute. Here's Matt's quote. This is straight from actually something he was talking about just a minute ago. This is a really generous reading of the situation, I think, to say that DH has become this sort of a provocation for rethinking the field. Another way to think of it is that DH has become a way to sort of project all of our anxieties. I was going to point to this quote from a piece in the LA Review of Books to talk about that. That was a sort of attack piece on DH, but why talk about this one when today we have a brand new attack piece on the digital humanities that came out literally today in the New Republic by Adam Kirsch that argues that the digital humanities is a dehumanizing or unhuman or inhumane, I don't know, whichever one of those you want to use, approach to the humanities. So again, what I read this as a sort of a projecting of anxieties onto DH about the sort of crisis in the field of English studies. And what's so interesting to me, and especially for our conversation, is that just a couple of weeks ago, this piece came out about the moral panic in English studies. And my home field of Comp-rhet is experiencing that same sort of problem, which is, what's happening? Blame them. They're the problem. So Comp-rhet and DH actually share this. At the moment when English studies is trying to figure out the way forward, figure out what we are and what we should be or what we should be doing, there's this sort of libidinal attachment to Comp-rhet and DH. So that's one of the things we share. I'm trying to start from what we share. Another thing that we share is this date, 1949. As I was prepping for yesterday, I was sort of hunting around reading some of the stuff that Matt had sent me. And I remembered or found, I forget which, that Four Cs is founded in 1949. That the conference happens and NCTE decides that Four Cs is a thing. It's not just this thing that we talk about, it's actually something that requires sort of institutional support. The conference had 500 attendees, which I think is pretty amazing for a conference that didn't yet exist. This happens in 1949, in April of 1949, and then this happens in 1949. Father Busa visits Thomas Watson. I was searching around and even posted it out to Twitter. I was hoping someone could find the exact date of that meeting because I really want to know when it was. I wanted that kind of, it happened in April thing to happen. But it didn't happen yet. If anybody knows that date, please let me know. The year is enough for me. So here is another thing we share. We share a kind of origin story. They're both myths, right? They're both too simplistic. C's doesn't actually start in 1949. We can point there and say that it does, but much was happening before 1949 that built up to that, just as Matt pointed out, the sort of unpacking of DH histories. So let's go back to Alan Liu's map, which I've sort of faded here. It's more faded than it should be on this screen. But this is Alan Liu's map, and it includes things like literary studies, media studies, historiography, science and technology studies, network theory, software and platform studies. Again, digital rhetoric, Comp-rhet, computers and writing are not on this map. And we're trying to figure out why. Because if DH is just humanities computing in the sort of old sense of text analysis, then it makes little sense for a lot of this stuff to be up here. There's no way that platform studies could be understood under that rubric. So it's a bigger umbrella than just sort of traditional humanities computing. And it's gotten bigger, but it's not gotten quite as big as the folks in Comp-rhet would hope that it would be. So I'm going to try to walk through why I think this might be happening, or at least give some context for it. So I'll give us another year, 1985, publication of one of my favorite things in the world to read, not because I agree with any of it, not because I think that it was, I think there was a purpose for this piece at the time. I think rereading it with graduate students is a really fun experience. It throws them to a moment that I don't think really fully kind of get. I'm seeing a lot of nods and smiles in the room, so people know this piece. It really is an amazing read. Maxine Hairston likens the relationship between literary studies and Comp-rhet to an abusive relationship. Domestic abuse. I think this is staggering. She says fighting that literature faction. She says fighting, she's talking about fighting for sort of recognition, but fighting for funds, fighting for all kinds of things. She starts the essay by saying, we've come a long way, we have a field, we have a discipline, we're here, we've arrived. And then she says this, Yet another amazing metaphor, by the way. Yet another, I mean, it's just, go read it again. It's a fight, it's a battle, and it's a battle that she feels we are losing continually. Here's where she says it's analogous to sort of domestic abuse situation. We are tied to our oppressors in complex ways. This is how she's talking about it. This is 1985. I should say that shortly after this address at SEAS and after the publication of this in SEAS, Maxine Hairston and John Ruskowitz come out of an English faculty meeting at the University of Texas where I did my PhD, and they look at each other and they say, do you want to just like start your own department because this isn't working? And so they start the Division of Rhetoric and Writing, and that's now the Department of Rhetoric and Writing. That's one way of dealing with this problem. Not my favorite way. That's why I'm here. 1987, Jim Berlin's Rhetoric and Reality. Different version of, or different way of covering this sort of split between literary studies and rhetoric and composition, or this divide, whatever term you want to use. For Berlin, the way to kind of understand what's happening here in terms of scholarly approaches is that rhetoric is about the production of texts and poetics is about the interpretation of them. This is on page 1 of the text, and it frames everything he has to say about this issue. Now, he does say at every historical moment these two are intertwined, that they inform each other, but disciplinarily this is how he wants to divide it. And what we'll find here in a minute or two is that this divide is playing out all over again in DH. 1993, Erica Lindemann writes about why literature should not be in composition classrooms. And in that piece she says, all they do in literature classrooms is appreciate literature and consume texts rather than produce them. Interpretation, not consumption. That's the pattern. 2011, right around the time of the sort of edited collection coming out, Matt's edited collection coming out, we have Alex Reed saying things like this, to say, when DH doesn't include us in their umbrella, we should, this is just the same thing all over again. There's sort of a two-prong complaint here. One is interpretation versus consumption. The other is lack of recognition of us as a sort of field that matters. Those are the two things that keep repeating. Cheryl Ball is in this camp as well, saying that DH is claiming to be doing brand new things that aren't brand new to us. She says they hold their noses at the long history of rhet comp research. Sound familiar? It's the same thing, it's the same debate, it's the same terms of the debate playing out all over again. 2013, Jeff Rice's piece in College English on Occupy DH makes the claim that digital humanities scholarship is all about interpretation. It's a kinder version of the argument. He's not belittling DH, though he does want things to go in a different direction. I'll let you read that piece on your own to figure out how. But he says, yes, we always interpret. The question is, do we only interpret? But still, associating DH with interpretation and rhet comp with production, and drawing the lines that way. And I think this is exactly what continues to happen. If we draw the lines that way, if we see them as separate things, the collaboration becomes difficult, if not impossible. So I want to offer a very brief coda, and then I'll shut up and sit down. How might we cross this line? I should say that title comes from a chapter that is somewhat related to this. A chapter in a forthcoming, the Crossing State Lines title comes from a chapter that's forthcoming in a volume called Rhetoric and the Digital Humanities, in which I have a chapter called Crossing State Lines. So I just, cribbed it. So let's tell a very quick counter history. Go back to those periods that Susan Hockey used to sort of tell the story of DH. In the 70s and 80s, she says, and Matt just showed you this, this is the consolidation moment in DH. In the 70s and 80s, things are sort of getting sort of some legs. Knowledge of what is possible had gradually moved through scholarly channels of communication. Hard to remember for us in the room what that looked like in the 70s and 80s. Very different from now. No Twitter, very different scholarly networks. But information was moving in certain ways. In this same period, computers and writing as a field basically is born. Hugh Burns writes the first dissertation, what is largely credited as the first dissertation about computers and writing. Part of that project was creating a tool called Topoi. It's a screenshot that you can't really see, but it's a transcript of a student interacting with a kind of chat bot that asks the student questions about a topic based on Aristotle's topoi to generate stuff for an essay and then prints out the transcript at the end. This is happening at that consolidation moment for DH. So how are these histories sort of intersecting? DH is consolidating and computers and writing is just emerging, just trying to figure itself out. That's a different kind of narrative than what we hear when we hear Comp-rhet people complaining to say, we've been doing this forever. Well, maybe not. Maybe DH predates computers and writing. Then we move to the 80s and 90s, into the new developments part of hockey's narrative. And this is where I want to stop, because this is a long wall of text, but I mostly want to focus on the fact that things are settling. TEI is sort of coming into its own, but this last sentence is what jumped out at me when I read this. Computers and writing was one topic that disappeared fairly rapidly. I don't know what she means by that sentence, because she jumps to something else right after and she doesn't explain what she means. Disappear for whom? I don't know. I think she means for people who identify as humanities computing. But one way to read that is that, yeah, of course it disappeared. It goes over there with the Comp-rhet people. We don't do the same thing. They'll take care of the computers and writing question, and we'll do this stuff over here. So disappeared is an interesting term there, and sort of jumped out at me as a moment where we might retell this story or start to rethink how these collaborations can happen, which I did argue in the blog post cited earlier, that it happens on an individual level and not necessarily at the level of the MLA or at the level even of NCTE. But this would be one place to start, to go back and retell these histories as side by side, as intertwined, as connected, rather than as things that sort of separate and diverge forever. So I'll stop there, and Matt and I will have a conversation. Thank you.
And whether DH needs Comp-rhet. I guess another way also of thinking about it would be to question whether there are reasons to keep the fields apart, or what can we find when we work together? And I think one of the things we wanted to do in this talk today is to find examples of projects that kind of productively bring together DH and Comp-rhet. So I was thinking that I might first begin by asking Jim, well, first to either address that question of whether these two fields and the people within them, whether we need each other, but then also what projects have you seen that might serve as examples of the kind of work that really benefits from a kind of cross disciplinary approach?
Let me try to get up here. So I mentioned the edited collection earlier, Rhetoric in the Digital Humanities, and I think this is a really important moment. It's actually sort of, I think it should be out in the fall, possibly late fall, early winter. And I think it demonstrates a kind of the folks in, I mean, it's called Rhetoric in the Digital Humanities. My own piece considers that question in terms of rhetoric and composition, and I've seen the titles of some of the others, and I think they do as well, though it might indicate that sort of perhaps rhetoric is more ready. The rhetoric end of things is more ready to sort of begin that kind of collaboration. But I think that volume really suggests that this question or this assertion that DH is just more interpretation, just more literary interpretation and appreciation, that there are some folks willing to move beyond that claim. And that collection, I hope, will do for us in Comp-rhet what Matt's did for the digital humanities, which it sparked more genre pieces, of course, but hopefully more than that, hopefully more than just genre pieces. Also sort of let people know the state of the field, the state of what people were doing and what people wanted to be doing. Because we don't have that many projects in the field that would slot so easily into DH. What we think of as DH work, and that term is just so difficult, right, is things along the lines of computers and writing. could be creating a video game, could be video production of some sort, video and sound composition. Sound has been a sort of massive point of growth in Comp-rhet, and I think also in DH. So here's a great sort of point of intersection. But we don't have any, as of right now, we're only now seeing sort of big data being taken up by Comp-rhet. And in that regard, I mean, Bill Hart-Davidson and Jim Rodolfo are doing some of this work right now. In fact, they're presenting, I think, some of that work at the DH conference this summer, which is another sign, I think, that people are willing to kind of move on, actually present it at, and you came to seize. But these are just the beginnings of thinking about a corpus sort of computationally. That's not been happening as much in Comp-rhet as it's been happening in DH. So those projects are starting to percolate up. I think people are starting to ask the questions that DH has been asking for a while about how to get a hold of a mass amount of text to analyze, right? With given copyright concerns, given the sort of access to text, we're starting to ask those questions. So these are moments where, when I point these things out, my people, my folks, I get strange looks because I'm always saying, hey, we could look over there, we could learn from there, because the immediate response is, yeah, but it never works the other way, right? It never comes in the other direction, and that's what I wanted. That's what I want this to be, right? Is a sort of two-directional thing. I think those are the sorts of projects that are starting for me to show that Comp-rhet and DH can actually. I can imagine Bill Hart-Davidson and Jim Rodolfo picking up the phone and calling Matt and saying, like, we're up against this problem or that. You've done this before. Let's talk. Perhaps that's already happened. I don't know. And those are the kinds of things I have in mind. Of course, we've been doing digital work for a long time, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's recognizable to folks who identify as DH, right? So my project that will be out in the fall, Ethical Programs, is a software studies project. That's recognizable to software studies people, but not necessarily. But software studies relationship to DH is vexed. So depending on how you define the digital humanities. So those are sort of the projects or possibilities that I'm seeing kind of percolating out now.
I wanted to pick a little bit on the quotation that Dominique read, which I think, if I remember that blog post, it came out around a sort of one of these controversies that emerges ever so often, which in this case was the Modern Language Association kind of reworking its divisions and discussion groups, and in that reorganization kind of, I think, creating what was widely perceived as a slight of Comp-rhet, and I think that one that is, since the widespread discussion of that has been really reworked. But I do think, I wanted to ask about the role of organizations in I don't know if the right phrase is kind of healing this split or in working through it, because one of the things that I've noticed, and I'll give you a couple of examples, is that professional organizations and conferences, like let's take Digital Humanities 2014, where you've noted Comp-rhet scholars are presenting. Jill Belli is presenting this year. More work, I think, that finds this groove between Comp-rhet and DH. That these organizations actually can play a pretty salutary role in concretizing connections between the fields. And another example I would give is the fact that Cheryl Ball now sits on the Digital Humanities discussion group in the MLA. So I think, and I salute her for kind of working to change the organization. In the call that group put out for its guaranteed set, which I'm also a part of, and the call that group put out for its session at the conference included explicit mention of Comp-rhet, because the panel was about rethinking histories of the digital humanities and finding new institutional routes or new ways of externalizing them. So sometimes I guess I feel that some of this work is already happening and that we're reluctant to acknowledge it for some reason. But I don't want to suggest that these, even if some of this work is happening, that the tensions aren't still there, because I think at moments like with that division and discussion group thing, we see them kind of bubble up to the surface. But I wanted to ask a little bit, do you see a potential for professional organizations in our fields to work through this issue?
Well, this is why blogging is dangerous. Because that piece grew out of a very specific moment and a very specific felt sort of experience. And this was the sort of the MLA saying, we need to rework these categories. But in reworking, say, various literary periods in certain ways, and by the way, Comp-rhet wasn't the only literary, or the only section that got sort of shrunk into something much smaller. It just happened to be the one that I was sort of the most invested in. They took all of writing studies, composition, rhetoric, history of rhetoric, theories of rhetoric, and sort of slammed it into one category. And I know a little bit of the backstory of this, but there was a committee assigned, the sort of rhetoric and writing MLA committee had written up some sort of suggestions about how to better deal with this problem, which were sort of either missed, ignored, whatever sort of verb you choose, and those folks are really frustrated by this. So at that moment, what I was feeling was, I have great conversations with Matt. I have great conversations with Matt Kirschenbaum. I have great conversations with other people who would identify as DH, and I know other people in Comp-rhet and computers and writing that would say the same thing. But I have such terrible interactions with organizations. Another story to tell is, 2 years ago, a call went out to ask if folks could review papers for the Digital Humanities Conference. I may have told you this story. I said, absolutely. In fact, that's not true. I'm remembering how this went. I complained about something about the Digital Humanities Conference, and Matt Kirschenbaum said, they always put out a call to see who would like to review papers. And they did, and so I walked the walk and said I would. I got an email a couple of weeks later that said, thanks, but we're really kind of full up, and we have enough people. And I thought, that can't be true. Like, I know how conferences work. There's never been a conference that said, we're good. We don't need any more people to review papers. That's never happened. So I know that wasn't the case. I know also that the person who sent me that email, who I don't remember who that was, probably had no idea who I was and where this was coming from, and looked at my job title and my CV and was like, what the hell why? It doesn't make any sense. Now, I shared that story with Beth Nowitzki. And the next year, I was reviewing papers. Be careful what you ask for, because now I'm just in the queue. But that's a moment where, of course, now these organizations are made up of people. Mm-hmm. Okay. So the organizations are not separate from the individuals. But the organizations have this momentum and have these histories that sort of pull them back and keep them from often fostering these kinds of communications, or these kinds of collaborations. So that's how I go back and forth. Mm-hmm. What I would say is these organizations can help with this problem or this set of questions because new people are involved in them. Mm-hmm. New blood, sort of the winds of change, right? These things are happening, and Bethany's sort of changing the way things are happening. Kathleen Fitzpatrick is changing the way things are happening. Mm-hmm. They can only do so much. The MLA is still the MLA. Mm-hmm. So I think I would not speak as strongly as I did in that blog post necessarily. That was very much, I spoke in general terms about a very specific incident. It wasn't just me either. The real frustrating thing about that was, people like Cheryl, in the wake of that, as much as Cheryl's sort of trying to sort of reach across this divide at certain moments, we're like, see, right. Here it is again. Right. Why should I try to do my part? It happens over and over again. So, and my frustration was more with that response than with what the MLA had done, because how am I supposed to keep asking people to reach across when the hand gets slapped away every time? So. Yes, I would say yes, these things can happen through these organizations, but only if there's ground up sort of support from people who are willing to do the work of collaboration.
The next question I wanted to ask you was to sort of work through this issue of this sort of production and interpretation divide, and to think about moments of production that we see happening in digital humanities work that, well, I know based on our conversations and leading up to this, that we both think might be a sort of interesting point of connection, collaboration, discussion between Comp-rhet and DH. And the first one I'd like to ask you to think about or to talk to us about is algorithmic writing and text generation, and to maybe talk about some of the work that you see happening perhaps in both DH and Comp-rhet that is thinking about the creation of text in new ways, and might help us think about how, I guess I would be curious to see how you think people from each field might be approaching that same task, because my sense is that there are compositionists who are working on algorithmic writing and who are exploring, as you have, sort of various automated forms of writing like bot writing, and others from DH who are doing the same thing. So I'd be interested in hearing if you think there's a difference in the way that we all approach that, or what connections you see.
Sure. I actually think the way folks who identify as DH and folks who identify as Comp-rhet are using, so to think of something like a Twitter bot, which there are armies of them now. That's a great example of this particular debate that we're having being completely irrelevant to actual scholarly practice. When I wanted to create a Twitter bot that wrote Erasmus's famous sentence, "Your letter pleased me greatly," and then tweeted out, this was an idea I had. I was like, how would I do that? I emailed Mark Sample, who said, you should check out how Darius Kazemi did it, and you should also talk to Zach Whalen, clearly identifies as DH, and you should talk to these people. And I talked to those people, and they said, here's how I did it, and Mark told me how he did it, and I kind of cobbled together my own version of things and got that thing up and running. It still every hour tweets a version of Erasmus's sentence, "Your letter pleased me greatly." At no point did I say, I should ask, did I care how that person identified in terms of field or discipline? I just wanted to ask someone what they were doing and how I could do it. And this sort of feeds directly into the sort of DH identity of collaboration and sort of the sort of general good feelings that surround DH, which I have to admit that sometimes that sort of discussion gets a bit much for me, right? That is, it's as if every digital humanist is perfectly happy to sort of sit down and spend 3 hours with you to talk about things. It's not exactly like that, right? And there are people who are perfectly willing to work in isolation who call themselves digital humanists. But there's an example of, I don't actually see any difference between what Mark's doing and what I'm doing. I think that I'm completely indebted to Mark in how I did that. The content happens to be a rhetorician. That's really kind of it, right? What we're after and what we're trying to demonstrate with that algorithmic sort of generation is pretty similar. The other thing about that term algorithmic is I immediately think of the Ramsey text, Reading Machines, which is about algorithmic criticism, which is about the idea that, it's about a lot of things, but it's, for me, primarily about the idea that every interpretation is an algorithmic interpretation, that we run algorithms across text to generate interpretations of those texts, then we change the algorithm and we change what the output is. We can now do that with computers, but it doesn't necessarily mean we haven't been algorithmically generating readings all along. But what I most like about that text is that Ramsey goes to the Oulipo to talk about algorithms and about how to interpret text, because the Oulipo were about using algorithms to generate text, generate things like poems from procedures and algorithms. A collective of authors who said, we don't think there's any such thing as a solitary genius. We think that an algorithm or a set of procedures can generate poetry just like a human can, and explored that. So Ramsey's not interested in algorithms merely or purely or just as interpretive mechanisms, but for him every interpretation is productive, and that what you're doing is generating a new text, deforming a text to generate a new text. How is that not about composition? Now, could he have cited work in composition to make that case? He could have. But I'm not the citation police, right? I'm not here to say, why didn't you cite X, Y, and Z when talking about this? He actually uses the term rhetoric in that book, not in a way that's recognizable to anyone in composition and rhetoric, in a sort of more, in a more literary studies type of way. But we can see him use the word rhetoric, and we can decide that he's not using it the way we like it, and so we get angry and stomp out of the room, or we can take it as an invitation to deepen his work in a different way. Well, here's how Steve Ramsey's using this word rhetoric. What if we thought of it this way? That's how I imagine my current work on algorithms and rhetoric, as sort of taking that invitation and running with it. So this is part of a new project that was mentioned, I think, during the introduction, called Making Machines, that's about thinking about the history of rhetoric as a history of algorithms. Rhetoric is at bottom a series of algorithms for generating or interpreting arguments, trying making sense of texts. We don't want to think of it that way. We spent the last couple thousand years saying, no, that's not what we do. We don't teach rule book sort of writing and rhetoric. We don't want people to just follow rules, but actually that is what we do. We tweak our rules and our algorithms based on a rhetorical situation, based on kairos, but we still initiate a sort of program when trying to make sense of someone else's argument or generate our own. So now I'd like to take that a step further and re-understand or reread the history of rhetoric through that lens. And the other piece of that is a website with these sort of machines for generating or interpreting arguments. I've just started this project, but I don't see it as opposed to Ramsey. I see it as following after Ramsey, to say, well, what if we actually did the rhetorical sort of, played the rhetorical game with this idea of algorithmic generation or criticism. And the other thing I want to say before I sort of hand it back to you is, one of the primary, I had Berlin's book up there, who really does this separate. He's one of the first that separates this out to say literary studies is about interpretation, rhetoric and composition is about production. But one of the key critiques of Berlin that's sort of come in the last 5 or 10 years is that all he really was interested in theorizing and teaching was interpretation from a sort of Marxist cultural studies lens that he thought would empower students and send them out into the world so that they could pick apart advertisements and show that they were racist, sexist, classist. And a lot of people are realizing that that's kind of, in Comp-rhet, are thinking, well, that might be a kind of a dead end, because what actually changes when we teach students this? Well, Berlin himself was very interested and invested in interpretation, the very person who separated these things out. So that's another moment where we can kind of look, that's another counter history we can tell ourselves and each other, that these divides don't work. They just don't work across disciplinary lines as much as we want to kind of draw them.
I'm going to turn to materialism for a little bit. So one of the slides I routinely show when I'm sort of giving a talk about kind of like what is DH is a slide of Erica Kaufman, who's a graduate of the grad center, is now at Bard, teaching a writing class by having students use makey-makey devices and sort of linking the writing process to various digital connections and forms and circuits. And I would like to use that to ask about two areas that seem to me really interesting possible points of connection. One is digital pedagogy. I think DH has been critiqued, I think rightly, but I would say in recent years less so, for not focusing enough on pedagogy. It seems to me that this is a really productive area for exchange, in part because quite often in classes we might be really teaching the same things, but also that there's a lot to be that I think could be incorporated into DH practice, from Comp-rhet scholarship on teaching and learning. But there's also a lot that could be worked through, I think, through Erica's example to create new pedagogies that really marry to both practices. So I'd like to ask you about that, but I'd also like to ask you, in thinking about making and material, I'd like to ask you about platform studies and Matt Kirschenbaum's work on kind of reading these writing interfaces and thinking about how computational platforms themselves are inscribed by humans and machines that are using them, how we might think through those texts and those moments of writing to find other common ground.
Great, thank you. That's excellent. Too much to say. Well, there's more and more of that, the kind of teaching you're describing. Who's the person that you mentioned?
Erica Kaufman.
Yeah, who's doing things with Makey Makeys, you said. I know myself and Kevin Brock and others are teaching Arduinos and other sorts of circuits. Gentry Sayers, who sort of straddles this boundary in a lot of ways too, is doing a lot with this sort of work. And it's very easy for folks. I mean, when I have to describe that work to people, either generally in my department or even people in my field, they do. The initial response is like, "You're doing what?" In a class about writing and about rhetoric, you're programming circuits, right? Mm-hmm. So we had to kind of step through how that's writing, how it relates to writing. A class that I taught in the fall, a graduate seminar actually called New Media Interfaces and Infrastructures. I handed them 2 platforms that I owned from my sort of my own life. That's what they were sort of stuck with because it's what I had. Half the class got an NES, 8-bit Nintendo. The other half got, and that was my second one. The first one I ran ragged and ended up having to buy a second one when I was like 12 years old. And the other was a Macintosh Classic that was not even my first computer. It was my mom's first computer when she used to work out of the house, and then it became my first computer. And I handed them to these students, and I said, okay, do a platform study. We read Bogos and Montfort's Racing the Beam. We read a couple of other pieces, one piece on the Nintendo Wii. And I said, tell the story of this platform and tell how it constrains cultural production or enables cultural production, how it constrains writing or enables writing. Because the case I wanted to make to them in that platform studies project is that, and this is actually a case that is going to be made in an essay that will be out there soon. Annette V and I are editing a special issue of the journal Computational Culture on rhetoric and computation. One of the pieces in there is by Liz Loesch, who's going to do a lot to sort of theorize the relationship between something like hardware and circuits and the rhetorical situation, as it's theorized by people like Lloyd Bitzer. So Bitzer theorizes the rhetorical situation as a kind of blockage, right, as an exigence that needs to sort of be dealt with. So there's a problem to solve. And one of the things Loesch will argue, I hope she's okay with me talking about it, it's still in the sort of draft stages, is that a computational platform is threaded through a rhetorical situation in a very important way, right? It shapes what we can and can't do at any given moment. Twitter is part of the rhetorical situation, not the background for it, right? Something I argue myself in a couple of places as well. So, and I think this is a place where we have to make the case to. We don't necessarily have to make this case to DH folks. They would just say, "Yeah, that sounds great. Talk to me more about what you're doing." When I turn to people in composition and rhetoric, I have to kind of explain to them why I have students opening up as I talk about opening up electronics, a phone just fell and blasted apart. I hope it's okay. Opening up an 8-bit Nintendo to kind of figure out how it works in a seminar in an English graduate seminar. I have to make the case that it's relevant. I think it's relevant, and I know why I do, but I have to be able to articulate it. Students have to be able to articulate it. Incidentally, they fixed my 8-bit Nintendo. That was not part of the assignment. And it was this is a story worth telling, I think. It was a $5 or $6 fix. This little 72-pin connector that the Nintendos have was shot, And it was shot because of, does anybody in here have an 8-bit Nintendo sitting at home in a closet? Does it work? Do you know? If it doesn't work, there's a good chance that the reason it doesn't work is that when your cartridges wouldn't work, you would take the cartridge out and what would you do? Blow on it, of course, right? Everyone knows. That's the worst thing you can do. Everyone did it. Everyone blew in the cartridge and blew in the game deck. What happens when you do that is you're spitting in the cartridge and you're spitting in the game deck and you're corroding the pins, and that's why none of these Nintendos work anymore. The students learned this in interacting with the object, right? Why is this thing not working? Well, lots of these, a lot of stores in town carry these 72-pin connectors, or one store in Madison, probably lots of stores here, because everybody comes in and says that my Nintendo doesn't work, and they say you need one of these, and it's because everyone spit in their Nintendo unknowingly, thinking they were clearing out the dust, which you weren't clearing out the dust. So these are things you learn by doing this kind of research, and they're not irrelevant to humanistic inquiry. They're not separate from what we do. They're part of what we do. That's the work of a historian, right? That's not just technical work or only technical work. So I think, so then to sort of turn very quickly then to your sort of, your mention of Kirschenbaum's book, Mechanisms. I mean, there's another book that if you read generously and generatively is all about writing. Because he's theorizing all the writing that happens beyond the typing on the keyboard, all the inscription that must happen for any of our writing to happen. He says, he essentially gets us thinking about all the sort of non-human writing that's happening throughout all of our computational mechanisms. And not to think, and to think about the materiality of them, how they are not sort of, how they're not immaterial or ephemeral, or right, that they need to be preserved, that they need to be considered and thought about. So again, there are ways to link all of these things together productively. It almost requires reading differently. This is something I teach in classes all the time, reading generatively, and I say reading generously in the sense of reading generatively. How do I use a text, say perceived flaws? You could call them flaws, or you could call them openings for further discussion, right? That's just sort of, if you just turn your angle like 10 degrees this way, you can see it differently. And I think we could all stand to do a little bit more of that. That would be a kind of nice launching point for lots of collaborations. Sorry, I'm following the Twitter feed, so if I laugh, it's because your tweets are funny.
Well, maybe now is the time to sort of open up this conversation to everyone in the room. So we would love to hear any questions you might have.
So I just want to repeat that for anyone who didn't hear, but the question is what's at stake in this sort of, in thinking about this boundary and trying to reach across it, what might be produced in doing so, what might come out of such collaborations? Fair? Is that fair? Yeah. Do you want to take a shot first?
I think that what's at stake are it depends on how one sees digital humanities. If this is a kind of new and emerging field, and one that is kind of consciously interdisciplinary, I guess my short answer would be that what's at stake are conventional audiences and ways of doing work, and that if we are consciously speaking to new audiences, which in practical terms does mean reading different or more journals, exploring different book series. I think there are these. I think a platform like Twitter has done much to bring many different kinds of scholars together in a common space. But often when scholars go and do their research and which, go to join their professional organizations. I mean, I think that's in part that's why I asked that question about organizations, because I do think that's one. I think scholarly organizations and publications, that might be one place where the stakes actually matter. What will and can conferences like Digital Humanities or like the 4Cs or like Computers and Writing look like if we think about these fields in new ways? What would a publication like Digital Humanities Quarterly look like if lots of people who primarily consider their field to be Comp-rhet were to submit pieces to it? So I think in some ways it's kind of our ingrained habits of reading and writing as scholars that's at stake. That'd be my answer.
My first answer is that I'm still holding out hope for the English studies model of the field. That is to say that the study of literature, the study of writing, perhaps even the study of other cultural objects, when we get into film, the film studies folks might throw things at me because they would say we're not necessarily in English studies. But nonetheless, I've moved through departments where this attempt to institute the English studies model has been met with lots of resistance. And I think partially because of the kind of the things we've been tracing out here is that people don't see similarities, they only see difference. And also because of wounds, because if you've been told for many years that what you do is worthless, and then all of a sudden you find that you're the one getting the jobs, and the job market is flipped, and now you're the one with power, and now the first year writing program is kind of the only reason that the English department is still afloat, et cetera, et cetera. Hard to say, yeah, now we should probably think about this English studies model. That's a hard thing for Comp-rhet to really want to do. I personally think there's something lost if we go our separate ways. I've never been able to articulate well why I feel that way. It could be that I did my PhD at Texas, where this split is so felt every day. And that could be, and I saw what came of that on a kind of local level, like at the level of kind of interactions between faculty and students, and I didn't like it. I loved being at Texas, and I loved Austin, don't get me wrong. But those interactions were counterproductive, and I'm going to keep spending time trying to figure out ways to not have them. So that'd be my first answer. The second, I would say, is less pie in the sky. And it is that the term digital humanities is being renegotiated right now. And if Comp-rhet isn't a part of that, it's not going to be a part of it. If it's not a part of that renegotiation, it's not going to be a part of that umbrella, ever. And so having a stake in what DH is doing, how it's redefining itself. I mean, DH doesn't mean humanities computing anymore, but it does. That's what I would say. Right now it still kind of does, but it's slowly changing. I mean, the conference is changing, as we just talked about. The organization and the journals are changing. Read DHQ. It's not, it's not your mom's digital humanities, right? So, but if we're not a part of that conversation, I mean, we don't have to be, I guess. We could be over here and just call it computers and writing. But there's so many interesting ways to kind of draw out the connections. I don't see why we wouldn't. We just have to let go of all this historical baggage, which is a difficult task.
I just quickly wanted to say too, I think, one of the reasons why, we read work across fields is because we find it tremendously exciting. And I think that so many of the people, I think both you and I, I read Tech-rhet, I read WPAL, you, and Enculturation, you read DH stuff. I think there are many other people in this room who are reading across these divides. And so I think even sometimes speaking across them more often is important as well.
Okay, well, one, I would say there's, yep. Of course, yeah, no, one thing that, right at the end of your question that I thought of was that the fourth R is algorithm for me, so, and that's the way I've been thinking about it now. That does you no good with the old guard. You don't have to say it. They would turn around and walk out the door. Okay, this is why you used the word multimodal. This is why the word multimodal that I resisted for many years, because I didn't quite know what it meant and I wasn't quite sure why people were using it. I've come around because of Jody Shipka. And Toward a Composition Made Whole, Shipka convinced me that what we're teaching is learning the available means of persuasion in a given situation, and they may not be words. That doesn't even mean digital. It could mean construction paper. It could mean, for her, dance. It could mean lots of things, sound, light, right? So if you approach it this way, now it's not about digital. It's about what's my problem I need to solve and which representational system allows me to address that problem. Now it doesn't matter what your students have at home. If it's not about teaching digital literacy, which a term which Greg Ulmer has been arguing against for years and no one seems to listen, that those two things are opposed, digital and literacy. But that it's now about teaching them to understand. I mean, that's not to say we shouldn't be arguing for access. We should. But those arguments only go so far, and the funds only go so far. The other approach is to say, you have a problem you need to solve, and words are one way of solving it, but they're not the only one. And knowing how to take up those other means, persuasively, expressively, can be part of our job. So the essay is one avenue. But Jody argues that we've assumed for too long that it's the baseline and that everything else is sort of parasitic on it. What if it's just one representational system alongside others? That would be my response. I don't know if it helps you with the old guard, but it's my response to the old guard.
I guess I sometimes feel like people think that they have to be digital humanists, or that's the work that DHers are doing. There's a sort of almost coercive force to it that DHers, people doing DH work, or DHers think that everybody should be doing DH work. And I want to say emphatically that I don't think that is the case, and that I was educated at a time when DH wasn't DH what we have now, and I'm perfectly happy with my education, what I learned. And I think there's so many different ways of teaching and learning that don't necessarily need to involve the digital. And so many of the ways in which people push back against DH, because it's often perceived as an attack on traditional modes of reading and writing. I think text mining is kind of and the distant reading of Moretti is the easiest figure for this. That oh, you don't want to read. And Matt Jockers actually says this. I'm not going to be reading individual books. I want to read the corpus. I want to read the patterns. And there are many people who find that very upsetting. But I first of all don't think that it has to be put in those terms. That there are many ways in which we can do both things at once. And I think that, as Jim is pointing to, the work that our students is doing can take multiple forms of kind of creation of meaning. And one of my favorite pieces in Debates in the Digital Humanities, one that was kind of attacked today in the New Republic, was Mark Sample's "What's Wrong with Writing Essays," where he had his students playing the Sid Meier video game Pirates, and they did sort of creative projects around that. And what one student did was to create what they called a captain's log on a piece of driftwood, and create visions of various screenshots of the game. And I mean that was a sample project that actually, as kind of Jim says, did not involve technology in its creation, but yet I think took the spirit of what's at the core of digital humanities, which is a sense of experimentation and play and collaboration with these materials to think of new ways of approaching our work. And personally, that to me is what I find most exciting about DH, is that for everyone who is upset about it, I mean, I just at this moment find it to be, to use the word Jim used earlier, it's an extraordinarily generative field because of the possibilities that it can generate. So I think for that reason, that's how I'd answer that.
Accessibility, the point that the gentleman brought up, I think accessibility, I understand, is a huge hurdle, but I have to tout my field. I work as a reference librarian at a public library, and public libraries across the country are seeing the need for young scholars to have a certain level of tech skill set, whereas before there were always, classes on very basic computer skills. And like the NYPL is taking on a project where 3 branches in the Bronx, students are going to be able to take home a Wi-Fi modem and have the actual capabilities from home to do this kind of work. And I'm in Matt's class, the DH Praxis class, and one of the groups, DH Box, is a librarian project that they're doing something where you would take home, I don't know how to explain DH Box, but I know that it's some sort of accessibility. And it's just, libraries are really understanding that people need these tools and making them more and more available. So I think that that's becoming less of an issue. Just wanted to say.
I guess, so what Melanie talked about was the various initiatives at the NYPL to find ways to give access to technology. And I guess what I just wanted to say, kind of building on Jim's point, that now is a kind of moment of where DH is being negotiated, which is to say that tomorrow's digital humanities may not look like today's digital humanities. And one of the kind of issues that's spoken about a lot is the fact that in the past a great deal of DH work has required a very serious infrastructure, technological infrastructure, and what we see now are more small colleges, community colleges, underfunded institutions trying to find ways to do DH, and sometimes it happens through collaborative infrastructure, sometimes it happens through virtual infrastructure, but that I think, and I would point you to the essay on that topic in Debates in the Digital Humanities, where it's about liberal arts institutions, which in fact are actually kind of facing some of the same issues in terms of technology. So one thing I would say is let's create new forms of digital humanities that actually don't necessarily depend on that kind of access.
I wanted to point, there's a question coming up on the Twitter feed that I think is worth noting, especially because it's someone who's not here in the room and someone who is here because he is friends with me on Twitter, and we have collaborated on some things. He has a very different, I think, sort of viewpoint on this, so I thought it was worth noting. His first question was, this is Kevin Brock, if you're following along on Twitter. He's a new professor at the University of South Carolina who does a lot with computation. He and I have worked together on a number of projects. I had him into one of my classes last semester to show students how to make things with these Arduino circuit boards. His first question was how to kind of integrate, how would DH and Comp-rhet be integrated beyond the split? And I think part of what's sitting behind there might be, what's sitting behind there is his second post, which says, and I'll just read it, I must be the only person reading our hashtag that doesn't see a philosophical divide between DH and Rhet Comp, especially comp and writing. I do see that philosophical divide as you saw today. I think that the attempt of this discussion is to sort of think with it, not to think it away. I don't think that's necessarily possible, right? But I do think there has to be a way to integrate these things in some sense. There are things that we do that we share. Those are some of the things you and I have been talking about. But it is important to know, and Matt suggested this earlier a bit, that there are strategic moments where they should be kept and can be kept separate. In particular, you talked about the writing studies tree. Is that what it's, I'm sorry, the writing tree or the writing studies? Writing studies tree. This is your project, yes? And the sort of challenges of getting funding for a project like that, making it legible to different audiences. Is this a DH project? Well, the DH people are like, how's this a DH project? It's about the people who teach writing. And then the writing studies people or the Comp-rhet people are saying, well, I don't know what to make of this thing because it's not about WPA and it's not about teaching first year comp, and it's not even really about rhetorical theory, right? So how do you make yourself legible? Well, Alex Reed makes the argument that DH is essentially a strategic tool in a lot of ways to get funding. That's true. That's great. But what happens when you try to use it strategically and someone says, I don't see how this is DH. I've tried this myself with just trying to present at the DH conference and submitting manuscripts to DHQ, which I just sort of touted as a thing you should read, which has rejected my essays. See what a big guy I am. But that's, again, an issue of legibility, of making yourself legible, and how do you use these labels strategically without becoming too cynical about things, and also in a way that recognizes the disciplinary conventions of each, that tries to bridge, but also says, at a certain point, they're called different things, they are different things, they involve different kinds of people. So I don't want it to be understood as saying that these different areas of activity should just be sort of blended together without any difference. That's not the argument. I don't think that's the argument either of us are making. But there must be more productive ways to engage.
Maybe to follow up on that point and go back to Cheryl Ball, she recently asked on Facebook for people in the composition and rhetoric community to nominate composition and rhetoric projects for the MLA prize that is confusingly a joint prize between bibliographic studies and digital technology, which would mean that they're looking for scholarly editions, you would think, digital scholarly editions, and she suggested we nominate the Writing Studies Tree or Jim Rodolfo's Writing Studies Map, these kinds of projects, and what will happen once they get to the MLA and they have to vote on these projects that are not digital scholarly editions or don't fit into both bibliographic and the digital projects. So perhaps you can speak to that, is like how can we maybe relabel or re-identify these kinds of organizational, systematic, right, whether they be prizes or funding or otherwise, to include more composition rhetoric projects?
Well, I think we might think about that in a couple of ways. One is to think about Matt Kirschenbaum's tactical piece about DH as a tactical term, and one that's employed and used at specific points to leverage opportunities for funding. I do think that there are an increasing number of funding competitions that are either explicitly open to Comp-rhet and DH work, or come from one field or the other that ask for contributions from the other field. And there are a couple that come to mind that initiatives are the Association for Computers and Humanities is now doing a series of micro grants that I think is applicable. The DH startup grants have funded multiple composition and rhetoric projects. So I think we need to continue to push at those boundaries, and I think it is the case that our organizations often, do move slow. I mean, I to sort of return to the earlier discussion about these funding models. An organization that has been around for a long time does need some time to shift, but I think we can look for small ways to enact those shifts, and sometimes it's by inserting language in calls that explicitly welcomes such materials. And so those are some of the small ways in which I think we can do that.
Okay, so the first thing I would say in this particular case, which may actually be useful in other situations as well, is I think the first thing to figure out is what these projects that will be submitted or that you think they imagine what are their larger goals, interventions, scholarly interventions, and then to figure out if you're making a similar scholarly intervention. Or if you can frame your project as making a similar scholarly intervention. So why does someone create a digital edition of something? What are they trying to do? Are those goals similar to the goals of the Writing Studies Tree? I think think in some sense they are. I think in other ways they're not. So if there's not enough overlap there, it's not the right place to submit it. I think what Cheryl's after is getting some of this cross-pollination happening. This might not be the right way to do it. The next thing I would say is an organization like RSA, like the Rhetoric Society of America, might be the better place to go sort of seek out that kind of support, and is only now, again, sort of is behind in this way, only now figuring out ways to sort of tap into digital research. So for instance, the RSA Summer Institute, which happens every 2 years and will be in Madison in 2015, has, as far as I know, and I could be wrong on this, has only had one, and I'm sure there's more, but I only know of one digitally sort of focused workshop. The RSA Summer Institute is a set of workshops and seminars that take place over a week over every other summer. There was a digital humanities workshop a couple of years ago, or I think 4 years ago now, in Boulder. The one in Madison has 4, which is, to me, I mean, might be because I'm on the committee, the Summer Institute committee. It definitely has something to do with that. But there's also the ability of the field to see this stuff as sort of important. And that's only now happening in places like RSA. So the funding mechanisms that are already in place in sort of some of these DH circles aren't in place yet for something like RSA. Essentially your problem is you're ahead of the curve for this kind of project. This is why you're basically, I'm assuming, just doing it for free right now. Yes? So these are the challenges. I think you don't want to, I mean, like I say, cross-pollination and collaboration is great, but also like, Cheryl might just be sort of trying to force something that's not going to work.
I mean, it's a funny thing that you're saying that we're ahead of the curve on this, because if you think about it, we're way behind the sciences and the math, right? I mean, STEM disciplines have been doing this sort of, just for context, kind of academic genealogies, thinking about how people get into the research questions they're into, in part through mentorship, through education, through collaborations like that. So it's one of these cases where I kind of want us to zoom back and realize that we've been spending the whole day focused on this like narrow divide within sub-branches, mostly of English. And I mean, this is not in any way to belittle all the great historical work and social science work and other things that are happening, but also to realize that if we want to see where computing is going, right, we should also at least talk about computer science, right? And some of these algorithms that are coming out, David Bly doing stuff in topic modeling that then Jockers takes into English and stuff like that. So if you guys want to talk about, zooming back out and doing a distant reading on DH, right? What are some of those incoming streams that you see right now as being perhaps especially, to bring it back to the topic, perhaps especially promising to this Comp-rhet and DH fusion? Well,
So I'll say one that comes to mind right away, which is, and your point's completely well taken, it's why I'm really interested in sort of subfields, or maybe it's a method, I don't know, like software studies, which are so open to kind of going and reading the computer science research and sort of figuring out what it might have to say about a humanistic analysis of software. One place that I hope will start looking more and more, at least on the Comp-rhet side, and I imagine this will happen in DH as well, is in terms of computer science pedagogy. How is the teaching of computer science shifting and changing? What are its relationships to the teaching of writing? I teach a freshman interest group at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I've gotten to teach it twice. I'm hoping to do something similar to it when I get to Camden. That's called Composition and Computation, in which students take a cluster of 3 courses. They teach first-year writing, Intro to Computation, which is a computer science course for non-computer science majors. And then they take my class, which is a bridging of those 2 classes, which is designed to get them thinking about how writing code is like writing and how it's not like writing, and how we can think about them side by side. And seeing the kind of, and I mean, that's been an amazing thing to get to teach that cluster, to sort of help sort of foster that sort of connection, to read the same things across those 3 classes. So I find out what those other teachers are reading, and then I assign it in my class so that they can read it again, but with a different instructor this time. And in teaching that class and thinking about that class, I've been thinking a lot about and reading around in computer science pedagogy. It also helps that I have Matthew Berland at University of Wisconsin-Madison, who studies in the education school computer science pedagogy. So, and he's a friend of mine, so I have a kind of way in. That's one place I think we can start to look, especially if we're talking about digital pedagogy.
I think that another area, and one of the interesting things people say about DH is that it's too text-based, that too much work is centered around text itself. And I think one of the kind of exciting areas that I'm seeing blossom in new ways is involved in data visualization and also algorithmic searching of images. So I think there's a huge area around data visualization, around visual rhetoric and interpretation, where we can see work kind of combining computer science and what's called DH, where also a composition and rhetoric perspective is needed and can help elucidate what's going on. The other thing that seems to me interesting is work that's being done on kind of automatic image analysis and visual of images. So thinking about how image searching is done through algorithms and written by computer scientists, and I think there's some really interesting work that's I guess a lot of times what I see happening is ways in which a humanistic perspective might be added to work in computer science that is kind of needed, and if with the automatic image searching and algorithmic searching, one other side of that is this kind of biometric image analysis. So in other words, which we might see, for example, in cameras that are looking across crowds at stadiums and identifying faces, and looking at actually reading the algorithms that are how these faces are actually identified, and how we had a talk last semester in the DH Praxis seminar, reading the sort of racial stereotypes that are built into a lot of these biometric programs. So I think when I try and pull back and do a sort of what you called a distant reading of DH, I think what we see is a field that's actually trying to combine these multiple perspectives and methodologies from multiple fields, and I think is still really feeling its way. But those two areas seem to me to be really potentially productive ways of finding some nexus that is provocative.
Okay, well, I'm sorry to say, but we're going to have to cut it there. 6 o'clock. Wanted to thank Matt and Jim